Bonjour tout le monde. Goedenavond. Welcome everyone. We are going to do this mainly in English, but also in French with English translation. So I hope everybody's happy with that. My name is Maaike Kofferman. I teach French literature at Radboud University Nijmegen, and I'm also a board member of Platform Frans, which is a network of specialist experts in French language and culture all over the Netherlands. So we have academic members, researchers, teachers, translators, and we kindly invite you, if you don't know our network yet, to take a little card when you leave and maybe join the club. Among the many things we do is organizing the Voltaire lecture, the Conférence Voltaire, which was conceived a few years ago by, among others, my colleague Alicia Montoya, here present in this room. And our idea was to make sure that people, thinkers, writers, researchers from the francophone world get a podium in the Netherlands, because we are very much focused on everything coming from the anglophone world, and there's so many interesting things going on and also very important things going on in France and in the francophone world, that we conceived of this lecture, this conférence, to have people from the francophone world share their insights from research, their thinking with a Dutch audience, or an audience based in the Netherlands. Before I introduce the speakers to you, I would like to thank Spui 25 and the University of Amsterdam for making this possible, and also my dear colleagues and alliés from the Institut français des Pays-Bas, Marion Claudel and Lauriane Piqueux. It was a pleasure to organize this with you all. I will now introduce our main speaker, Magali Della Sudda. She's a research director in political science in Bordeaux. She is specialized in mobilization and gender. She has done a big project on the yellow vest, the Gilets jaunes movement. She is now going to share today some insights from her book, Nouvelles, femmes, droite, which sheds light on how women are involved in extreme right movements, and how they change the discourse, change the discussion on feminism. And then the second speaker is going to be Professor Sarah Bracke. She works here at the University of Amsterdam. She's a sociologist of gender and sexuality, and she will share some perspectives from her own research, which builds on very similar topics and questions. And then the discussion will be moderated by my colleague from Nijmegen, Emily Schuman, who is a cultural scholar specialized in how race, gender and sexuality are expressed in popular culture and visual culture, popular music and visual culture. So this is promises to be a very interesting little hour, 1 hour and a half maximum that we're going to have together. I will click on the slides and hope that the translation will be synchronous with the French text that Magali is going to say. So Magali, thanks for coming to Amsterdam, and I give the floor to you.
Goedenavond, hartelijk bedankt voor de invitatie. Je suis désolée parce que mon néerlandais s'est rouillé en 25 ans. Je dois d'abord vous dire que je suis très émue de l'invitation qui m'a été faite par Lauriane Piqueux et Maaike Kofferman il y a quelques mois, de venir ici présenter mon travail. Parce qu'en l'an 2000, c'est ici que j'étais étudiante en Erasmus à UFA pour me former aux études de genre et aux études sur l'extrême droite. J'ai eu la chance d'y rencontrer mon amie Ineke van der Valk, qui est ici dans la salle et qui est aussi une chercheuse sur l'extrême droite. Mon ami Wouter Koolmans, qui est aussi dans la salle et avec qui je suivais les cours de Meindert Venema sur l'extrême droite en Europe. Je remercie SPA 25 pour l'accueil, l'Institut culturel français à Amsterdam et vous toutes et tous qui êtes ici ce soir. En février 2026, il y a quelques semaines, la mort d'un jeune militant nationaliste à Lyon a été fortement médiatisée. Avant même que les premiers résultats de l'enquête de police ne soient connus, des vidéos ont circulé sur les réseaux sociaux incriminant un groupe antifasciste, la Jeune Garde, et un parti politique de gauche, la France Insoumise, dont un des députés avait fondé la Jeune Garde. Ces vidéos, elles ont même circulé ici aux Pays-Bas, en Italie et partout en Europe. À l'origine de ces vidéos se trouve un petit groupe de jeunes femmes, le collectif Némésis, aujourd'hui si influent sur les réseaux sociaux et dans l'espace médiatique que son récit, son narratif, a été largement repris jusqu'à l'Assemblée nationale, où une minute de silence fut observée en mémoire du jeune homme aux sympathies néo-nazis affirmées et pourtant connues. Quelques semaines plus tard, en mars 2026, une porte-parole du collectif Némésis, qui se dit féministe identitaire, Claire Géronimi, fait son entrée au conseil municipal de Saint-Quentin, dans l'Aisne, comme conseillère municipale. Depuis le mois de novembre 2019, pas une manifestation féministe ne se déroule à Paris sans que le collectif Némésis ne fasse son apparition pour fustiger les féministes accusées d'être complices des violences sexuelles commises par les immigrés. Et aujourd'hui, ces jeunes femmes semblent incontournables à droite sur le sujet de l'immigration, de l'islam et des femmes. La France n'est pas isolée. Dans de nombreuses démocraties, des partis d'extrême droite ont désormais à leur tête des femmes. Marine Le Pen a présidé le Front National depuis 2011, puis le Rassemblement National jusqu'en 2023. Sarah Knafo, actuelle candidate aux élections municipales de Paris en mars 2026, était tête de liste du parti Reconquête aux élections européennes. En Italie, Giorgia Meloni, militante du parti fasciste du mouvement social italien, puis de Fratelli d'Italia, est la première ministre de la République italienne depuis 2022. En Allemagne, Alice Weidel préside l'Alternative für Deutschland également. Et sur les réseaux sociaux, des influenceuses clament leur opposition aux féministes de gauche, affirment leur indépendance et leur opposition à l'immigration africaine et à l'islam. Ainsi, aux Pays-Bas, Els Recht, pseudonyme d'Els Noord, proche du PVV et de Geert Wilders, et puis ayant fait des allers-retours avec le Forum pour la démocratie, ou l'influenceuse Eva Vlaardingenbroek, qui dénonce l'immigration et le grand remplacement. Les électrices, quant à elles, ne sont plus rebutées par ces partis qui ont longtemps combattu les droits des femmes, affichant un virilisme en bandoulière. Et bien que le genre demeure structurant dans le projet politique de l'extrême droite, désormais, l'extrême droite semble avoir patrimonialisé la cause des femmes et euphémisé le rejet explicite de l'égalité entre les hommes et les femmes qu'il avait caractérisé pendant des décennies. La question qu'on va essayer de traiter ce soir, c'est comment la bataille du genre a été l'occasion pour ces partis d'extrême droite en Europe et ailleurs de se normaliser. Qui sont les militantes qui ont œuvré pour porter la cause des femmes dans cet espace politique qui jadis était très hostile au féminisme? Quelle est la part des dynamiques internationales dans ces évolutions? Et comment rendre compte de tout cela? Pour ce faire, et pour éclairer cet apparent paradoxe de femmes qui choisissent de s'engager contre les féministes et finalement peut-être contre la cause des femmes, j'ai mené une enquête en France entre 2014 et 2021 auprès de militantes d'un groupe qui s'appelait les Antigones, qui a aujourd'hui presque disparu, de militantes d'un groupe mixte qui s'appelait Génération Identitaire, qui visait à conquérir le pouvoir en dehors des urnes par l'influence. Donc et c'était un des groupes les plus féminisés à l'époque des droites radicales. Et puis j'ai essayé aussi d'interviewer d'autres militantes nationalistes qui ne m'ont jamais répondu. Donc j'ai collecté d'autres matériaux sur les réseaux sociaux, sur la presse, sur Internet, et j'ai combiné comme ça les méthodes pour pouvoir répondre à cette question. Je dois expliciter quelques éléments de définition. Donc, les droites extrêmes et radicales désignent les organisations qui se situent à l'extrême droite du spectre politique. Elles ont pour point commun de porter un projet politique qui est xénophobe, dans lequel la communauté politique est fondée sur la culture et sur des caractéristiques biologiques. La famille est un maillon essentiel de la production et de la reproduction de la communauté politique. Nous le verrons tout à l'heure dans la discussion avec Sarah Bracke notamment. Et ces courants-là, ils se divisent et ils se divisaient entre un courant nationaliste qui pense la lutte au niveau de la nation, qui en général considère que l'État doit être fort, et il se réfère aux régimes totalitaires et dictatoriaux du passé en Europe. Et on a aussi un courant dit identitaire qui a un horizon d'action européen. Et c'est en cela que ces droites radicales sont interconnectées entre elles. C'est qu'elles conçoivent leur identité, un petit peu comme dans Le Seigneur des Anneaux. On est chacun avec nos singularités. Tous ensemble, on fait une alliance européenne pour défendre la civilisation et on ne se mélange pas. Ça, c'est leur caractéristique. Longtemps ouvert à différentes spiritualités, ce courant identitaire, aujourd'hui, il a patrimonialisé le catholicisme ou le christianisme comme un marqueur de civilisation face à l'islam, comme les nationalistes. Et il est représenté par ce groupe Génération Identitaire qui a été dissous en France en 2021. Aujourd'hui, ces courants que je vous ai présentés, ils se rejoignent, ils ont convergé dans une bataille contre l'égalité de genre. C'est ce qu'on a appelé en France la manif pour tous, qui était une opposition spectaculaire au mariage civil homosexuel mené il y a un peu plus de 10 ans, en 2012-2013. Et puis je vous montrerai ensuite comment, à la faveur de cette coalition contre l'égalité de genre, ont émergé ces femmes, ces nouvelles femmes de droite, qui se distinguent vraiment de la génération précédente de militantes d'extrême droite ou conservatrices des années 80 ou de la fin des années 70. Et puis, ce que je vous expliquerai aussi, c'est que quand je mène l'enquête, il y a deux pôles au sein de ces femmes de droite. Il y a un pôle fémo-nationaliste qui est assez lié au parti d'extrême droite, et puis il y a un pôle qu'on va appeler écologiste conservateur, qui aujourd'hui a disparu à cause de la polarisation, notamment de la question environnementale. Et puis on verra enfin en conclusion comment les dynamiques internationales structurent un peu tout cela. Donc je reviendrai d'abord sur le fait que les cortèges de la manif pour tous ont été un creuset pour les droites en France. Et les droites radicales, conservatrices et extrêmes ont trouvé un ciment, comme une glue symbolique, au moment des contestations du mariage pour tous. Ça a été une occasion extraordinaire de politisation, comme un mai 68 conservateur, à partir duquel donc, les droites se sont coalisées et ont cru pouvoir reconquérir une hégémonie culturelle et faire émerger de jeunes militantes. Dans ces groupes-là, dans cette contestation, voilà les nouvelles femmes de droite qui ont émergé. Les femmes étaient en position de leadership. Et on a vu donc ces nouvelles femmes de droite, des Antigones se créer à Paris, à Marseille, les Cariatides à Lyon, donc dans différentes villes de France. C'était un moment de normalisation qui était lié aussi au fait qu'en France, pour pouvoir se présenter aux élections, les lois devenaient de plus en plus dures et il fallait que tous les partis puissent présenter des femmes autant que des hommes. Et à l'extrême droite, les femmes manquaient. Et donc, ça a été une opportunité formidable pour des jeunes femmes de pouvoir donc se présenter comme candidates. Voilà ce que me disait un militant. Les femmes, c'est comme les grenouilles. Women are like frogs. C'est par cette métaphore surprenante qu'un militant de génération identitaire m'expliquait en entretien pourquoi la présence des femmes dans les rangs de son organisation était si importante. Les grenouilles sont un indicateur de bonne santé écologique dans la nature. Et les femmes, comme les grenouilles, indiquent qu'une organisation politique est saine quand elles peuvent y militer. Ça garantit un fonctionnement harmonieux parce qu'elles ont des qualités plus féminines, et puis ça permet de se distinguer d'autres groupes qui ont fait des images un petit peu violentes, néo-nazis. Et ça permet donc de se distinguer des partis d'hommes que l'extrême droite était jadis. L'autre élément qui est intéressant et qui permet à ces femmes de conquérir leur place et d'être en position de leadership et d'ouvrir les droites à des thèmes jadis portés par la gauche, comme la défense de l'intérêt des femmes, c'est qu'elles vont pouvoir articuler la question des inégalités de genre à celle de l'immigration. Les inégalités de genre, pour les droites extrêmes et radicales, aujourd'hui, ne sont pas liées à un système inégalitaire, mais sont le produit d'un patriarcat d'importation. Ainsi, effectivement, quand le Front National évoque les droits des femmes à la sécurité comme un droit primordial, quand il proclame que le vrai féminisme est défendu par Marine Le Pen contre les féministes de gauche, immigrationnistes, comme ils disent, eh bien, il opère un double mouvement. D'abord, on disqualifie les droits des femmes tels qu'ils ont été reconnus par les organisations internationales et les États depuis les années 70. Droit à la santé sexuelle et reproductive, autonomie, égalité dans tous les domaines. Se voit remplacé par un autre droit qui serait un droit à la sécurité. On renouvelle ainsi l'antiféminisme. Et ainsi, on peut dire aux féministes qu'elles se trompent quand elles continuent à engager un combat pour l'égalité, puisque tout serait désormais acquis et que le vrai problème des femmes serait l'insécurité, importée par des hommes de pays culturellement patriarcaux, autrement dit d'Afrique, ou des hommes musulmans. Le second mouvement qu'elles font, quand elles disent cela, c'est qu'elles confondent la cause des femmes avec celle de la nation. Plus concrètement, la lutte au nom des femmes se fait contre l'immigration et contre l'islam. C'est ce que Sarah Faris désigne comme le fémo-nationalisme. Cette confusion s'opère par une stratégie de communication qui va souligner systématiquement les violences sexuelles ou sexistes quand elles sont commises par des hommes d'origine africaine ou orientale ou musulmane. Et c'est ce que ma collègue Charlène Calderaro désigne comme l'ethnicisation du sexisme, ou ma collègue Francesca Scrinzi observe comme racialisation du sexisme. Et on repère cela très bien. À la fois donc en France, voilà le collectif Némésis, hein, on les accueille, ils nous égorgent, et puis ensuite on voit comment on assigne toujours certaines caractéristiques aux auteurs de violences sexuelles et sexistes pour montrer qu'ils ne sont pas comme nous, qu'ils viennent d'ailleurs, et donc il faut lutter contre l'immigration ou comme l'islam. Voilà. Donc quand je commence mon étude, le groupe qui est le plus visible en France, c'est un groupe écoféministe conservateur qui s'appelle les Antigones et qui se battent, elles, contre les autres féministes et contre les femmes notamment pour restaurer la vraie féminité, la féminité dans sa nature, contre les néo-féministes. Elle renouvelle beaucoup la lutte contre la contraception, contre l'avortement, non pas au nom de principes moraux, mais en faisant une question écologique, une atteinte à la santé des femmes, à la santé de l'environnement. La pilule ferait changer de sexe les poissons et polluerait l'environnement. L'avortement serait une violence faite aux femmes et à leur corps. Et on renouvelle ainsi l'argumentaire en le déplaçant vers la question écologique. Souvenez-vous, le début des années 2000, il y a une très forte politisation des questions environnementales. C'est moins le cas aujourd'hui. Voilà. Et puis on est dans le sillage de l'encyclique du pape François Laudato Si. À côté d'elle, donc elles reprennent la rhétorique féministe, à côté d'elle se trouve une revue, la revue Limite, fondée en 2017, qui veut jeter des ponts entre les écologies radicales et le conservatisme, qui propose un féminisme intégral d'inspiration catholique pour s'opposer au féminisme libéral et intersectionnel. En 2017, le lancement du féminisme intégral, ce courant politique et philosophique, réunit ainsi toutes les mouvances de cette écologie conservatrice et toutes les jeunes femmes qui en sont des militantes ou des porte-paroles. Ainsi, l'une des rédactrices, la jeune philosophe Marianne Durano, venait de publier son essai « Mon corps ne vous appartient pas », dans lequel elle entend démontrer l'imposture des féministes libérales. Elle a beaucoup de relais médiatiques et jouit d'une grande popularité jusqu'au début des années 2020. Elle porte un discours très critique du libéralisme économique, de la technologie, et trouve une oreille attentive, non seulement chez des femmes catholiques et conservatrices, mais aussi chez des écologistes radicales. Et elle réussit ainsi à attirer vers elle des militantes écolo-radicales qui ne perçoivent pas qu'au fond leur discours est antiféministe, qu'elle s'oppose à l'avortement. Et puis il y a cette jeune femme, Eugénie Bastier, qui est aujourd'hui éditorialiste et journaliste au Figaro et qui est sur beaucoup de plateaux télé, qui à l'époque était donc l'une des militantes de ce groupe. Ces groupes écolo-conservateurs, ils ont disparu et aujourd'hui on est dans un moment d'hégémonie du fémonationalisme. On a dans ce courant fémonationaliste d'abord la persistance des vieux nationalismes héritiers du XXe siècle. Donc ça, ce n'est pas une manifestation des années 30, c'est les cariatides lors d'un défilé du 8 mai en 2016 qui sont une manifestation d'une sorte de nationalisme de témoignage. Elles sont très peu nombreuses, liées aux extrêmes droites nationalistes européennes, telles que la phalange espagnole, par exemple. Contrairement aux autres nouvelles femmes de droite, elles conservent leur antiféminisme virulent, très explicite, rejettent l'homosexualité et professent leur nationalisme qui va de pair avec aussi un antisémitisme très affirmé et un rejet très clair de l'immigration. Cette tonalité, en revanche, n'est plus de mise au Rassemblement national. Donc ça, vous voyez, c'est fini ça, c'était les années 80, le cercle Femmes d'Europe. Depuis que Marine Le Pen a pris la direction, le parti a abandonné les outrances de langage et affirme avoir pris ses distances avec les groupes violents. S'il demeure très difficile d'obtenir des chiffres sur la féminisation du parti, on constate qu'une part croissante de femmes est dans l'organisation, à la fois sous l'effet de dynamique interne, mais aussi sous l'effet des lois sur la parité, qui ont fait avancer l'égalité hommes-femmes, y compris dans les partis d'extrême droite. En dehors des partis, il y a donc les militantes du collectif Némésis qui sont les plus visibles. Associations dont le nombre d'adhérentes n'est pas très connu, je pense qu'elles sont peut-être une centaine, une quarantaine de noyaux durs, et qui a pour objectif la lutte contre les violences faites aux femmes, les violences gynécologiques, les violences sociétales et familiales. C'est un collectif qui se définit comme féministe identitaire, mettant en avant une dimension de civilisation européenne dans son combat et qui a un projet politique libéral sur le plan économique, avec un État réduit à ses fonctions régaliennes. Il revendique son inspiration d'Allemagne, de l'Ukreta, qui avait été fondée après les violences sexuelles commises en 2015 lors de la Saint-Sylvestre à Cologne. Sa présidente Alice Cordier est une jeune femme qui a milité dans différentes organisations d'extrême droite, l'Action française, le syndicat Uni, et elle est la fondatrice du collectif Némésis. Les militantes s'étaient rencontrées via les réseaux sociaux à un moment où, depuis MeToo, la vague féministe semblait inéluctable et où ces femmes de droite extrême et radicale ont entendu surfer dessus donc pour populariser leur projet. Leurs actions retiennent l'attention elles procèdent par stratégie d'imitation des féministes, comme on le voit, elles reprennent leur visuel, et de parasitisme. Ainsi, en 2019, lors d'un grand cortège de manifestations féministes, le collectif Némésis fait sa première apparition. D'habitude, ces militantes identitaires ou nationalistes, elles se tiennent à distance, elles sont en dehors de l'espace de la cause des femmes. Et là, Némésis tente une incursion pour stigmatiser les féministes et leurs violences. Elles vont provoquer une altercation avec leurs pancartes anti-immigration et les militantes féministes leur demandent de partir. La scène est filmée, elle est relayée et ainsi elles pourront dire « Voyez l'intolérance des féministes et voyez comme elles sont complices de l'immigration et donc des violences faites aux femmes ». Ce qui est intéressant, c'est que les filles du collectif Némésis vont conquérir peu à peu une audience médiatique et des soutiens politiques. Bruno Retailleau, ancien ministre de l'Intérieur, qui salue leur combat. Vous avez également Marlène Schiappa, ancienne secrétaire d'État aux droits des femmes, qui, depuis quelques mois, relaie systématiquement ou presque leur communication. Vous avez l'ancien ministre de l'Intérieur également, Gérald Darmanin, qui soutient leur action. Elles engagent ainsi un combat culturel, parviennent à diffuser leur narratif, leur cadrage, et notamment à les imposer après la mort de Quentin de Ranc, donc en février 2026. Mais ce succès-là, il ne peut pas se comprendre sans avoir à l'esprit ce contexte international favorable à leur stratégie et à leur projet politique. Ce phénomène n'est donc pas exclusivement français. Comme vous le voyez ici, c'est un sticker de Némésis qui a été repris de Pegida en Allemagne et diffusé localement dans la ville où Charlène Calderaro menait l'enquête. Et on voit bien comment elle détourne à la fois les actions de solidarité envers les migrants, mais aussi comment elles reprennent les codes de leurs camarades d'autres pays d'Europe. On les voit aux États-Unis, on les voit aux Pays-Bas, donc, où Elsrers avait fait l'actualité après avoir lancé un appel à manifester contre l'immigration, qui s'était soldé par des confrontations violentes, et durant lequel elle avait fustigé la gauche, en disant que les gros fascistes sont les personnes de gauche. Cette rhétorique réactionnaire, c'est aussi celle de Némésis. Alice Cordier qualifie ainsi, depuis plusieurs années, le député antifasciste Raphaël Arnaud de terroriste, et elle a soutenu et accompagné un projet de loi qui visait à qualifier les antifascistes de terroristes il y a quelques mois, bien avant la mort de Quentin de Ranc. La mort de Quentin de Ranc, après cette rixe entre militants fascistes et antifascistes, a donné un écho formidable à cette rhétorique. S'il est très délicat de suivre les sources de financement de ces groupes, on sait néanmoins que le réseau Atlas Network soutient l'Institut de formation politique, qui est une structure de formation politique des droites en France, fondée au début des années 2000, qui doit pouvoir former une élite politique internationalisée, capable de faire l'union des droites libérales, libertariennes, conservatrices et populistes. Alice Cordier, des membres des Antigones, mais aussi l'influenceuse identitaire Thaïs Descuffon, qui sont nettement moins habiles et soutenus que Eva Vlardingebroek, ont bénéficié de cette formation. Les réseaux identitaires internationaux se donnent aussi à voir lors de rencontres internationales ou de rassemblements. En septembre 2024, le collectif Némésis était présent ainsi à la tribune lors du rassemblement de soutien à Tommy Robinson, un militant suprémaciste britannique condamné par la justice en Angleterre et qui aurait inspiré à Elsrers son appel à manifester contre l'immigration. Aujourd'hui, d'autres groupes de femmes, de nouvelles femmes de droite, sont fondés en Suisse, en Italie et au Royaume-Uni. En conclusion, il faut rappeler que la visibilité importante de ces jeunes femmes de droite, du collectif Némésis ou de ces influenceuses ne doit pas faire oublier la faiblesse de leur effectif. Leur importance numérique au sens digital est inverse à leur poids numérique au sens de leur nombre dans la rue. Certes, un collectif comme Némésis revendique plusieurs centaines d'adhérentes, mais nous n'avons aucune preuve. Et force est de constater que quand elles font des actions, elles sont au mieux 80 personnes de toute la France. Peut-être une dizaine d'activistes dans le noyau dur. Tandis que les collectifs féministes sont implantés partout en France, dans n'importe quelle province, à la campagne. Et ça, c'est très nouveau. Elles disposent d'un maillage territorial, diversifié, intergénérationnel. Et si des liens existent à l'international avec une prédilection en Europe, cela ne constitue pas pour autant une armature suffisante pour déployer un militantisme massif comparable à ce que furent les associations féminines conservatrices du siècle dernier. En revanche, la présence stratégique de ces activistes dans des lieux de pouvoir et de représentation culturelle, médiatique, leur donne une influence certaine et qui pourrait peut-être être importante en fonction des prochaines élections nationales. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup. And let me first start by thanking indeed the organizers of this event for bringing us all together, for inviting me, and un tout grand merci to you, Magali Della Sudda, for giving us all this, for your wonderful book and for giving us this food for thought and these insights and these frames. I want to pick up on three things. And the first thing that I want to pick up on is this notion of a paradox that you've also mentioned. You've also said an apparent paradox. And I think it's important to take a step back and to really think about what happens when we look at this involvement of women in right-wing movements through the framework of a paradox, which your research actually gives us a lot to go beyond that framework of a paradox. So you show us that there have been traditional movements of these far-right women that have always been there, that haven't gone away. You also show us the logics and the pathways and even some of the financing that account for this involvement and this rising involvement of women in far-right movements. So you really give us tools to undo this framework of a paradox. And I just want to emphasize how important that is and to continue to undo the framework of a paradox. Because what is a paradox, right? A paradox is a statement that seems to contradict itself or is logically untenable. And the involvement of women in right-wing movements, well, it's not logically untenable, it's happening and it's increasing. And when we think that there is a contradiction there, to really understand what is happening, I think we have to really pause on our own assumptions of what is contradicting what is the contradiction here. Because if we go back to this idea of women's interests and also the idea of equality, which Magali, you mentioned, the feminist notion and feminist and constitutional notion of equality. The idea that not everybody wants equality, or including not all women want equality, I think is a reality, right? It's not necessarily a paradox, it is a reality. But, and the idea that there might be other interests that drive these women, because clearly they're very much involved and committed and driven by things. But what then are these interests if clearly they are not equality, or maybe not equality as we have understood it, maybe not the liberal notions of equality? So this is kind of the first thing that I wanted to pause on, and maybe we can come back to it, like this notion of paradox and a need to go beyond it. And the second point I want to just reflect a little bit upon is precisely that notion of interests, women's interests. So if these women are driven clearly by a lot of values, norms, commitments, interests, what is it then that they are driven by? How to understand these interests? And again, the idea of they might be confused or they don't really understand what their real interests are or should be, I think doesn't bring us there, right? So let's take seriously what these interests then are. There's a number of themes to pick up on, but I want to pick up on two. One, because it was very prominent in Magali's presentation, the anti-immigration, and so forth, and safety. But I want to flip it around and think about not start with anti-immigration or safety, but think about the crises of contemporary society. Also, with scholarship in mind on fascism, we know that fascism rises in relation to societal crises, right? So what is the crisis here? Not only the interest, but the crisis. And I do think we have a major crisis when it comes to violence against women, right? Violence against women, despite every feminist mobilization, more liberal gender mainstreaming policy programs, violence against women has not disappeared. And so this ongoing crisis of violence against women, which again, Me Too recently in recent history has put out there again to say, hey, this crisis is still here, it has not gone anywhere. On the contrary, it's taking, some more obvious forms than it used to. So this crisis that has not been solved, in this right-wing ideology, a solution is proposed to this crisis, right? And that's where then the safety, but the anti-immigration. So the solution to this crisis is proposed as, stop migration, defend so-called our civilization, whatever that means, and it shifts every time when you try to study what it means. And the crisis of violence against women will end. Now, do I believe that narrative? No. Is it a narrative that you can, in the current situation, make seem somehow plausible? Yes, I fear. And I want to talk about a second crisis, and that is a crisis of care. The crisis of how productive and reproductive work are organized in our societies, right? And again, despite centuries, decades of feminist organization to make the distribution of productive labor and reproductive labor, paid labor and care labor, to make that more equal, despite more liberal gender mainstreaming policies to intervene there. Again, the progress is really small, right? And so we still have a crisis of care that actually has globalized. So in this global crisis of care, it has not been solved. And if then the discourse is, the ideology is put forward, we can actually solve this crisis of care that feminists have not been able to solve, liberal states have not been able to solve. We can solve it through going back to more traditional gender norms. And I'm thinking here of a little bit piece of research that I have done on the tradwife movement in the Netherlands. It is a solution to that crisis, right? Do I think that it is a solution to the crisis that makes sense and that will actually solve the crisis? No. But again, for instance, to young women, can you make that story sound plausible? I fear you can. So that was my second point, right? So there's these societal crises that actually some of these ideologies present a story that at least some women will recognize as, this is in my interest. And then I want to end on a last point and to talk about the racial politics about all of this. Because to whom does do these stories make sense? To those women, and again, there is no inherent essentialist reason why women would not be racist, in the same way that there's no essentialist reason why women would be in favor of equality. So the stories of solutions to the crisis of violence against women, solutions to the crisis of care. And we could do the same with solutions to climate crisis, right? I think we've touched upon that. So solution to all of these major crises involves a racial politics, a politics of taking care of our nation, putting the boundaries around our nation, but with a racialized understanding of our nation. This is, in a sense, what I see that is happening. It's a national body which is racialized that will work for its own, read white women, interest of women. And there are white women who think that that indeed will at least provide a solution for them. For all women, no, but for them, yes. Now, I come to this place or this argument through the study of contemporary replacement conspiracy theories, right? So, le grand remplacement, but also umvolking, white genocide. So this kind of rise of contemporary population replacement conspiracy theories. which are about the decline of the nation and a nation understood as racial. Let there be no, and I know that in some contexts, using the term race and racialization and, might be a bit sensitive. Actually, the French context is one of them, right? But I think we can't get there if we don't think through, an analytical concept of racialization. For instance, so these are some of the people that I have been reading. If you look at Camus, when he talks about French and defending the French nation and French, it is not a question of French citizenship, which he actually qualifies as un coup de tampon encreur sur un document administratif, a stamp on an administrative document, right? Rather, he says, that's not what we're defending. We're not defending stamps on documents. We're defending un peuple européen de race blanche, de culture grecque et latine et de religion chrétienne. So European people of white race, Greek and Latin culture and Christian religion. So this is, yes, it's nationalism, but it's racialized nationalism. So these are discourses of the dying race. And this is an expression that I use from my dear colleague Matthias Gardell, a Norwegian, a Swedish scholar of the far right. So the idea of the dying race, and when we think of these, le grand remplacement and some of these far-right ideologies in terms of being motivated by this idea of the dying race, and we have to do something, when we think of a race, a so-called race that dies, gender and sexuality are at the heart of the matter because it's about demographics and it's about reproduction. So we need to further explore the ways in which questions of race and reproduction are entangled, an entanglement which the scholar Alice Weinbaum has conceptualized as the race reproduction bind. And I'm going to end by, first let me say something. So this race reproduction bind, as Weinbaum conceptualized it is really about, let me put it a different way. Weinbaum argues that the ideological operation of this race and reproduction entanglement usually remains concealed, that we actually have to excavate it to see where it's happening. And the fact that it is concealed is part of how it operates. So part of what I've been trying to do in my research is, looking for those instances where it comes up, like for a moment, it's there in full, I was going to say full glory, but that doesn't sound right, in full exposure. And I'm going to give you briefly two instances. One instance is US-based when Roe v. Wade was revoked, so a strong attack on reproductive rights. A MAGA congresswoman, Mary Miller, had a speech, a political speech, a day or 2 days after the revocation of Roe v. Wade. And in that speech, she was introduced by Donald Trump. And so she thanks Trump when she takes the stage and says, and thank you for everything that you've done, referring also to the Roe v. Wade revocation, and calls it, this is a victory for white life. And so the moment it gets picked up on social media and, people push back, what dare she say? And then a press statement comes out like it was a slip of the tongue. It was the victory for the right to life. So the right to life and white life got Freudianly slipped somehow. And so it was a mishap, it was a stumble, and everything moved on. But to me, these are one of these moments where you have the full exposure of, these, Roe v. Wade, and only a month before there had been a great replacement or a white genocide shooting in the US, in Buffalo, in a supermarket. And the point that we actually have to read these things together, these racist attacks and these attacks on reproductive freedom, because they are actually linked. And I'm going to end with a second instance, and we can have, this slide. A second instance is A fiction, comes from fiction. I am assuming that most of you know Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, so I don't have to go into that iconic dystopian novel. But I want to point out, not in the Hulu television series. I actually think the Hulu television series made a mistake there to not thematize this point. But if you go back to the original novel and the epilogue of the novel, which isn't in the dystopic Republic of Gilead anymore, but at an academic event 50 years later, when scholars are trying to make sense, how did we ever get into this fascist dystopian Republic of Gilead? And one of the things that they, what happens at that academic event is that they go back to, what were the conditions at the time that this fascist society could emerge. And so this is one of the quotes. Men highly placed in the regime were thus able to pick and choose among women who demonstrated their reproductive fitness by having produced one or more healthy children, a desirable characteristic in an age of plummeting Caucasian birth rates, a phenomenon observable not only in Gilead, the republic, the dystopian republic, but in most of the northern Caucasian societies at the time. Now, Margaret Atwood was writing this in 1984, I think. And so, using, the Caucasian birth rates in a science fiction novel, whereas now this is precisely the discourses, of course, that we hear in the population replacement ideologies, is the plummeting white birth rates. And so to understand how a dystopian Republic of Gilead, which in popular culture is represented as a question of patriarchy, right? Like it's the most patriarchal society that you can think of. So it's sexism and patriarchy, how that actually from the beginning was tied up with racial politics that was obsessed with plummeting white birth rates. So it is that race reproduction bind that Weinbaum argues is central to understand modern political formations, but tends to remain obscured, needs to be excavated to fully see how it's working. That I think is really, to a great extent, what is also happening here with these gender dynamics of right-wing movements, and a group of women who actually sees their safety, their solving of productive labor, reproductive labor questions, solving of maybe some of the climate change questions in the framework of a white supremacist society. On that hopeful note.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Magali. Thank you, Sarah, for your fascinating remarks. And you've really given us many rich avenues to develop in discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time for that. I'm going to get us started off with a few questions to both of you, and then we'll leave a few minutes for questions from the room as well. To begin, Magali, I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to Sarah's remarks. I'm curious if you feel the crises that she's identified and the failures to resolve those crises, do they resonate in similar ways in the French context?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, for the crisis, sure, we face the same crisis, and there's a lot of anxiety about demographics right now. Also because mostly due to pollution, the fertility rates is decreasing amazingly in France among men, mostly. But when a man is infertile, it's the woman who gets cured, actually. Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety, but not all the new right-wing women answer the same way. That means that identitarian activists such as the Thaïs Descuffon and these activists online, they do embrace this kind of pro-natalist trade wives or whatsoever narrative, like making white babies to save the Western civilization. Whereas collective Nemesis women, they do claim they are feminists. They don't say anything about partners, kids, family. Actually, they don't have babies. So they are very cautious with that. Also because they are in their 30s, and many of them and their generation is facing this issue of infertility. And I guess maybe it could be also a kind of, backlash if they are too explicit about this. They want to appear modern, progressive, autonomous, self-made women, make money, have leadership, and it doesn't fit with the trade wife narrative. Maybe it's specific to France, maybe, because women always worked, as John Scott said, since wages are too low in France for centuries.
I was really struck by something you said, Sarah, where you said not everyone wants equality necessarily. And it made me think of, in your book, Magali, you talk about how certain groups adhere more to an idea of complementarity between men and women, so less equality, but the sense of kind of innate, inherent differences that complement one another. So I was wondering if you would agree with that statement that Sarah gave us at the beginning, and how that might pan out differently in France. You mentioned a bit for Nemesis, for example, when it comes to traditional gender roles, but are there groups or even online spaces where we might see more of this return to traditional gender roles?
Sarah's remark is really sharp, because not all women want equality in many aspects. First of all, for right-wing women, they don't want social and economic equality. They fight for women as themselves, white, but also petty bourgeoisie or bourgeoisie. So it's also a class struggle there behind this. They do not endorse redistribution of wealth, and they want welfare state down. That's also very clear. And it's true that not all women want equality, and you might find in the Cariatide or identitarian women this discourse about complementarity and yeah, we are different and we don't have to play the same gender roles. And that's why gender is a problem for sex, and gender equality is a problem for us as women. That's true. But these new right-wing women, women of the, like Nemesis, they try very cautiously to avoid publicly this kind of discourse. Because as most of the surveys show, most of French women, and even some men, are attached to gender equality achievement for men and women. So if you are too explicit about inequality, it also may plays against you, and yeah, you will be labeled as old school far-right women.
Sarah, I want to give you an opportunity. You sowed some breadcrumbs there for your research on tradwives, and I wondered if you might tell us a bit more about that. Would you agree, based on what Magali has been saying, that this feels quite distinct to the French context, and how have you seen this return to traditional gender roles come out in your recent research?
Does this work? Yeah. So, and I think the differences are often about how a discourse can be articulated in a public sphere, right? So I think there's a lot of, the discourse of complementarity as a value that somebody holds or will talk about in private. I think that is all over, well, the different European contexts or also US contexts that I'm aware of. But then the question is, how do you make that into a public discourse? And I think in the Netherlands, for instance, it is easy. I mean, I think the heavy religious, like for instance, the Catholic or other religious traditions have always, they have the theological backing to do the complementarity discourse, right? But you are right that sometimes that can be seen by, in the dominant public sphere, that could be seen as, that's a bit old-fashioned. But when I think of how discourses can be articulated in the Dutch public sphere, the idea of, it's my own free choice is a very strong one in the Dutch sphere, right? So I do think we have more young women here who will say, yes, you have the more religious, seen as old-fashioned way of doing complementarity, but in the Netherlands you also have young women saying, but this is my choice, right? So the kind of the discourse, my body, my choice, my life, my choice, weighs particularly heavy in the Dutch context, I would say. Whereas the discourse on égalité weighs particularly heavy in the French context. So I'm not entirely even sure if it's, if one could say like, oh, these are really different groups of women, or I think it's really about different articulations in the public sphere. But so I haven't done systematic research on tradwives, but I have found myself in public conversations with tradwives in the Netherlands. And for instance, and maybe this is somebody to add to your gallery, Magali, of all of these female figures, leading figures. In the meantime, in the Netherlands, Forum voor Democratie has a female leader as well, Liedewij de Vos. And so I'm thinking of the Forum voor Democratie because there's a group of young women there that calls themselves, I think, the Forum for Democratie Girls for Baudet, or the Girls Army for Baudet, something like that. And they embrace the tradwife discourse, even though, like some of them, the one that I was in conversation with called herself an aspiring tradwife, because for the moment they still needed the income and the money, right? There's a whole economic side to this. So it was an aspiring tradwife, as in, it's like aspiring social mobility, right? And so we're having this conversation, and it's a podcast, so the ones who, understand Dutch, I can actually send you the podcast link. And there was a configuration where, she was invited as a tradwife, another younger feminist was invited as the so the tradwife, the feminist, and I was invited as the professor. So there was like this triangle, and so I noted that, the feminist did a lot of, feminist values, but in a very liberal, which works well in the Dutch context. This is my life, this is how I want to. And so, and the young aspiring tradwife woman, similarly, and I thought like, okay, this setup is overdetermined. I now have to play this role of, the professor who brings the structural analysis. And so at a certain moment, one of the questions was, but do you think that a father can really take care in the same way of a baby, right? And so the aspiring tradwife was like, didn't want to do essentialist statements, but kind of said, but honestly, I'm the one, I'm the only one who can breastfeed. Okay, no, there were some essentialist statements, but and also saying, and I spend most of the time, the attachment is much more, right? So, and then the young feminist was like, but I'm sure that attachment could also be created with a father, right? So they were all about, this nuclear family and how to organize a nuclear family. And I was like, you know what this hypothetical child doesn't have in both of your stories? It doesn't have a village, right? And it doesn't have a village because we're in, 4 decades, 5 decades of neoliberalism that has dismantled care, right, in all kind of ways. And so everything to do with care, with reproductive work, not only for children, you know, for sick people, for parents, for oneself, you know, everything to do with care has become individualized on individual shoulders. And then on that level, it almost seemed as if the feminist individual choice was at the same level of the aspiring tradwife individual choice. But the larger, you know, social story, structural story of, you know what, neoliberalism has dismantled, you know, any kind of welfare care networks, and that is what the child needs, remained out of the picture. And the interesting thing was, the podcast was actually for a quite right-wing television station, and so and everybody on the team was women, also the technical woman, and then, you know, the interviewer. And so at a certain moment it seemed that everybody was fascinated by my structural story. And afterwards, the aspiring tradwife, we stayed on a bit longer, we were talking, and she said, I never heard the story, I never heard somebody put it like that. And so this is, for me, this was actually one of the moments that I started thinking, you know what, these young women, they were, you know, I could play the older, they were all about there. You know, these young women, in one way, are all struggling with a societal crisis and trying to make sense of it. And the one goes more racist than the other, and the one goes more, you know. But the stories that would actually make clear that that tradwife answer will never be an answer to your crisis of care, those stories are hardly part of the political parties, or they're not popular anymore, and there's no way to, you know, spread them to the young women and the young men who need to hear these stories. That was kind of my first moment of flipping it around. Yeah, that's a long answer to your question.
A long answer, but an excellent answer. And I think, you know, that's something that's come up quite recently on the left as well, is that we really need these structural, material solutions to these crises in order to compete in the current political landscape in many nations. So yeah, that's a great point to bring up. Also in the spirit of drawing maybe connections or pointing out divergences between the French context and the Dutch context, what I find really interesting in your research, Magali, is how you point out that how opposition to gender equality and marriage equality was really a federating, politicizing moment for these women on the right, particularly involvement in La Manif pour tous. And I'm curious, Sarah, to come back to you, if you've seen a similar sort of crystallizing issue or protest movement in the Dutch context and right-wing issues, and if not, could you say a bit more about maybe the distinction between the Dutch context and the French context in terms of how far right-wing figures position themselves regarding LGBTQ+ issues and gender equality issues?
Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure if I have a good vision on that. The thing is, when I think of crystallizing issues, well, okay, you know what, the Dutch, they don't take to the streets in the, you know, or strike in the way that the French can do. So it hasn't been like this mass movement, right? Because La Manif pour tous was a mass movement at certain moments. So I don't think we've seen it like that in the Netherlands in relation to questions of gender and sexuality. The far right really has been mobilizing in relation to migration on number one. But then if we think of the moments of, you know, without the mass movement, but of controversies in relation to question of gender and sexuality, there has been for sure the racializing of violence against women. I'm thinking of, you know, the protests against asylum seeker centers, or against violence against women. I'm thinking of the case of the young woman Lisa, who was murdered in August last year, and that happened to be an asylum seeker, while of course in the Netherlands every 8 days, every 7 to 8 days, a woman gets murdered. Which, you know, doesn't make the news in the same way than when it was an asylum seeker, right? So, but that, so there we had gender being mobilized in the public debate. I also think we've seen sex education has had its moments, right? Like what is being taught in schools, but that in France has also been. So sex education, but this is a little bit different. The trans bill, a year ago, there was a new trans bill making self-identification easier and so forth. And that was stopped in the context of a far-right government. But it's also really interesting if you look at, I have a PhD student, Iskra de Vries, who is looking at how that trans bill was stopped. And some of it you can identify as this is anti-gender discourse. And some of the discourse also goes, wayward, right? And, more acceptable liberal language and, maybe the health of people, right? Like, wouldn't it be in people's health interest to, have a more sound medical procedure or medical process, and not just have self-identification. So it wasn't a straightforward anti-gender discourse. There was some in it, but I think the most straightforward anti-gender discourse maybe has been in relation to sex education in school, but without the mass mobilization.
I'll just have one more question for you, Magali, before we open it up, so get your questions ready. You began your presentation talking about the mediatization of the death of Quentin Durand and the role of Nemesis therein. And I saw significant parallels to the political and media class's reaction to the assassination of Charlie Kirk in the United States, and the role that his widow, Erica Kirk, has played in sort of the aftermath and how that's played out in the media. I was wondering if you see similar parallels, and if you could say a bit more about how these women on the far right position themselves specifically in regarding the question of political violence.
Thank you so much. I guess that what happened with Charlie Kirk was also a kind of how do you say, répétition générale for what's going on now, that's for sure. They politicized the death of Quentin Durand and political violence, since actually politicization of political violence is something that they do for several years. They also tried, I must say, to politicize political violence inside far-right movement, because Alice Cordier was hit by a French nationalist in a bar. They were having a drink, and he said, "Why you women, you should stop now, because we can't work with you. You're too feminist." And she said, "No, me and my girls, we will keep on fighting, because we will make." We will legitimize far right. We will legitimize nationalism. We are the future. And so they started to argue, and he hit her in the face. And she tried to make it public. But as soon as she did that, she was cancelled from the kind of product sellers, because these women who have online activism, they also merchandise products. So it was an issue, and then she stopped. She removed all the videos she made, claiming that nationalists should now stop with violence against women because they are behaving like barbarians, Muslim or Africans. So she stopped that, and she focused on far-right, far left, and anti-fascist political violence. And it's the main target. So it's not only immigrants, but it's also immigrants' allies, feminists, but also left-wing parties and anti-fascist organization. And it's been months and years that she is focusing on that. So it's long-term work, denouncing political violence when it comes from the left. Thank you.
Thank you both for your answers. I think we're ready to open it up to questions from anyone in public. I saw a first hand here and then here.
Hi. Yeah, first, thank you very much. It has been very interesting listening to this talk so far. Thank you for being here. My question is, it regards the paradox that you mentioned before. I like to talk about Alice Weidel for a second again, the leader of the AfD in Germany. I mean, she's a lesbian, married to an immigrant woman with 2 kids and lives in Switzerland. I mean, that's the biggest paradox there is, seeing what she proposes. But my question is, are those women really the heads of the organization? Or are they rather pawns to be used as like a foot into the door, to appear moderate, and then to be discarded later on? I mean, we can see how Trump is throwing away his women ministers, or Kristi Noem, or things like that. And I just wonder if the far right, as soon as they get the popularity, or the AfD reaches #1 in Germany, which is currently 2nd, will those women be disregarded? What do you guys think?
So yeah, I would say the answer is in your question. So it's both dynamics, in the sense that women as Alice Weidel, Alice Cordier, Nemesis, the leaders in far-right movements, they do not believe in equality. They are the elite and there's the mass. And what they proclaim as political project, it's for everyday women, but they are not compelled to act and to do what they want other women to do. So that's the first thing. You can have a partner coming from abroad, and it's not a problem. You can say you want to save civilization and make baby, but don't have a baby. So that's the first part of the paradox. And the second part is that from the interviews I made, there are women who are very proud of being autonomous. The women I made interview with, they were not involved into political parties. They came from that way, that part, but they want their own space of activism because they wanted to be independent. It's true that the money comes from somewhere, and who gives the money? It's men, rich capitalist entrepreneur in France, Pierre-Édouard Stérin, Vincent Bolloré, but also this Atlas network. And it's men, basically, that's true. And the Antigone, they disappeared. And my guess is that because they don't have support anymore. They are not invited anymore in the media, in the conservative and right-wing media. So there are both dynamics. They do believe they are autonomous and they have leadership, but still, there are also other social relations and power at stake here, and especially with men. And some men, they do accept that women have leadership as long as they don't threaten their own leadership. And maybe we'll see what will happen in the Rassemblement National. Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella. We'll see what will happen in Reconquête, if Sarah Knafo will take the leadership, or if Eric Zemmour wants to keep it this way. So it's yeah. But I think there will be a battle here.
I mean, I very much agree with that. I think that many of these women, I mean, without knowing them personally, but clearly many of them have the wager that they will be able to keep leadership, right? Whether it happens or not will be a battle. But I think they have set their eyes on that power, and they know there will be a battle. Like, they know there's sexism in the environments where they are, moving, right? They know there's sexism in the far right, but they would say, as there is sexism elsewhere. So that is their battle. I think that's how they would approach it. And I'm just going to repeat what I said. Like, I get the sense of paradox. I mean, it seems all over the place. But I think if we really want to and understand it well, but also understand what we can do to counter some of this, we really can't get stuck in the sense of paradox. Like, yeah.
Thank you very much. Just coming back to the question, I suppose we're in that question all the time of where does this come from? I'm interested in all these different groupings and different kind of slants on the topic, whether there are any examples where race is not a very strong factor, whether really racism drives a lot of it. I also wonder in how far it does seem paradoxical because it feels so kind of regressive, a lot of this, but is this maybe for some young women a way of being rebellious because they are actually rebelling against something that's maybe in their eyes more deeply entrenched, which is feminism. And also I'm wondering if it's a factor for some that the right is on the rise, therefore, you know, that this train has momentum. If you want to have influence, get on this train. And lastly, I'm just wondering in how far it's a business model. Magali, you just mentioned influencers, you know, making money out of this. I just wonder how strong that factor is as well.
So I think I was just writing down the words. I think it was John Dewey, the philosopher, who said something about democracy has to be born anew each generation, right? And I think that's with feminism, with anti-racism. So I think we can't take for granted, like, you know, oh, we check off that we now have, you know, women's equality and we have anti-racist legislation and we have, you know, we have check. So that, it doesn't work like that. So, which is why I think maybe not in the leading figures, even though some of these leading figures are relatively young when you think of, you know, the age of politicians. But if you really see in the movements why it attracts many young women, and in the same way that, I don't know, the manosphere attracts many young men, right? So I think there's a new generation that, you know, and I want to take responsibility for whatever that means. Like, it's not a personal responsibility, but I think both as, you know, professionals but then also maybe as feminists, like, there are moments that we have laid back and taken things for granted, and it simply doesn't work like that. And I think if you look at the younger generation growing up in this time and age, you know, it's crisis after crisis. And going back to something I said in the beginning, I'm now rereading a lot of also the new literature on fascism and how entangled the rise of fascism is with crises, right? And so, you know, this crisis after crisis, what is the response from, you know, whoever this us is, right? Like, whether it's professional, you know, political, as parents, like, what is the response? Is it kind of a very easy liberal? I mean, just if we, Kirk, right? Go to the US example. What did the Democrats have to offer? You know, and I know that the Trump vote, there's all reasons to kind of take for granted, or you know, to see that there, you know, the vote was tampered with, right? But if you also just think this, there has been a kind of, I don't know how to put it, maybe Magali, you can, you know, a kind of, you know, a mainstreaming, professionalization of some of these issues that are about, you know, democracy, equality, feminism, anti-racism, but that come from, you know, radical traditions that people had to fight for that. And there has been, you know, some kind of easy, you know, it's a policy now, you know, and this is, you know, here, next generation, here is the policy. Don't infringe on the policy. It doesn't work like that. So I think there is, on the one hand, in the light of crises that are proliferating, that real renewal, we haven't done everything we could for the real renewal. Whereas on some of the far right side of the spectrum, some of these movements you can call radical and movements of renewal, right? So I do think the answer is a kind of a renewal and radicalism of equality, not a liberal mainstreaming. You know, we have that, but the radical equality.
To it's also true that they try to frame their action and strategy as rebellion against institution, against professionalized feminism, against femocrats, and all this stuff. So it's true, but it's always rhetoric of reaction. It's always a strategy. They are highly trained professional of communication, and there are really few persons, few activists, at least in France. It's true, they are in Paris, they are very close and to reach political and economic entrepreneur. That's true, but there are very few women, few activists, but very visible, very vocal, and so it's only about discourse that they are rebel. The second thing is that while they are doing this, they divert our attention from issues such as ecological crisis. Don't forget that Atlas Network is funded by oil companies, by plastic business, it's really capitalistic, big enterprise who are funding these political activists indirectly. And I think it's also to play down the coverage of ecological crises, social inequalities, that can also explain why they take such a lot of space to talk about issues that, I mean, if their program is applied, who will think that they will solve problems for women, that they will reduce violence against women? If you ban immigration, it's not a solution. You will still have rapes, you will still have harassment, so...
If I can quickly add on that. So here are the different levels, right? So I think some of the things we've said before that is really on the level of, those young women and young men who end up, going to the demonstration or voting for one of these parties, right? But then if you look at higher up levels, I mean, if you... going back to fascism and the emergence of techno-fascism, or now the re-emergence of techno-fascism, if you then look at the people with money, like an Elon Musk, who, looks at the landscape and says, aha, here's where we're going to, like with the Alternative für Deutschland, right? Like, okay, here's where I'm going to put money, I'm going to put my voice, I'm going to put my social media platform. So it's this convergence of, clear multi-billionaire, whatever, interests in what some people already call a post-equality society, right? Like post-democracy and post-equality. So there is that interest on kind of really higher industrial, techno-bro levels, and they have the money and the infrastructure. And, and they're looking for indeed that more grassroots. And so I'm guessing as a sociologist, I first try to think of what motivates these people, these young people, right? But yes, we need that other part of the analysis as well.
I think we probably have time for 2 more questions if we take them together. Or 1 more question, that's it.
Hopefully the answer will be short, so thank you for being here. You called your book The New Women of the Right, not of the Far Right. We've spoken a lot about far right. Can you tell us maybe more about the right, non-far?
Thank you for the question, because it's an important point of the book. When Dworkin wrote Right-Wing Women, she tried to understand from their own perspective what women in the US who were mobilizing against equal right amendment thought. Why those women who were very important, and it was a mass protest against equal right amendment. Why so many women against equality? And she said, well, these women, they feel that they are secured, that they are safe at home with their husband, earning money. Some of them were former workers, working class women who didn't make a good wages, who stopped working when they got babies, when they were, you know, they gained a higher status. They went to live in the suburbs. All the life is organized around kids, the car, consuming, small house. This is classical right-wing women, let's say. New right-wing women, they are young, educated, they come from petty bourgeoisie or wealthiest background. They went to university, they live in urban areas, and they were how do you say, they are millennials. They are women who grew up with the idea that they could achieve whatever they want. Autonomy, economical autonomy, leadership. So it's very different. It's very different. And most of them I interviewed, not most, but in the Antigone, most of them came from radical right background. One came from ecology, Les Verts, the Green Party, actually, the youth branch of the Green Party, but the other ones, they come from far right. Collectif Nemesis. There were women who come, some of them from far right, but most of them from classical right. When they were young, they were ready to endorse Nicolas Sarkozy, les Républicains, and it's just that they have more opportunities in far-right parties. So there's this kind of career in politics made available in far-right. They have a lot of money since they have a lot of seats in parliament, in European Parliament, and this is a new way to become a professional. So that's why it's new right-wing women, but it's true that they have a radical right and, according to me, a kind of far-right project because they fight against equality.
All right. Well, I think that was our last question, if no one has come up with anything in the meantime. So thank you all very much for being present here today. Do you want to say a final word?
I would like to have the final word.
Of course.
I don't know if this is working, because I want to thank you as well, Emily, for your excellent moderation of this talk. And merci, Magali, d'être venue de Bordeaux à Amsterdam pour retrouver la ville de ta jeunesse, mais aussi pour partager avec nous ces idées qui vraiment nous font réfléchir. And well, this was a Conférence Voltaire the way we intended them to be. So something really bringing insights from the Francophone world, and then entering into dialogue with the Dutch situation. And thank you, Sarah, for taking on that role so excellently. And I think it's really. The fact that you have been here, that you know the Dutch situation, that you speak a little Dutch, also is very, very helpful. So I'm very happy about this, how this has turned out. And I thank you all for coming. And please, if you live and work in the Netherlands, and if you're interested in following us and attending more of these kinds of events, please take a card of Platform Frans. And on that note, I wish you a very pleasant, sunny evening. Thank you very much.